Like many of us, my parents used to love going to live events before the pandemic struck. From sporting events to concerts, the atmosphere, as well as maybe being a little too physically close to strangers, brought them a sense of excitement and enjoyment. I can specifically recall one event that they were elated about: Billy Joel live at Lambeau Field. The music of Billy Joel defined their childhoods, and they had been in anticipation for months to see him perform. Now I'd like you to imagine, they are in line inside of the atrium on the way to get to their seats. They get their tickets checked, and they're directed to their ADA accommodated seats due to my dad's physical disability. Until they're stopped by security and told that due to certain protocols they are required to escort my dad by wheelchair. Now I'd like you to keep in mind, my dad has a below-the-knee amputation, had been post-rehab for almost 5 years at this point, meaning that he is fully capable of walking independently. He just requires some extra assistance in case of emergency. The security staff insists on taking my dad by wheelchair, and my parents reluctantly agree. As he is being wheeled to his seat, taken up by elevator, they arrive before my mom, and security dumps him out of the chair onto the ground and leaves him lying on the floor. As my mom came to find him with nobody there to help him, my parents had a few choice words regarding the lack of appropriate accommodations for my dad's needs. Like most societal labels that define us, I'm sure we all have some sort of preconceived idea of how somebody who is disabled looks. Before my dad became physically disabled, I had always associated the term with a complete inability to walk, or speak, or even hear. But many people lack the fundamental education to understand that disability lies on a spectrum, and accommodation is not some sort of one-size-fits-all solution. My dad tells me stories of how he struggles every day with his disability, and many of the issues he faces have more to do with the mentality of blanket accommodation than a lack of accommodation entirely. If in our everyday lives more people took the time to practice awareness and accommodation, we could create a more inclusive and understanding environment for those around us. I am going to touch on the importance of practicing awareness regarding disability by first talking about getting rid of preconceived ideas and standards of the disabled community. Second, covering the importance of recognizing necessary accommodation and accommodation as a spectrum. And finally, bringing to light the importance of everyday acts of ableism that can be modified to better accommodate the disabled community. Now, I'm sure we have all mindlessly scrolled through social media and seen that video, and I think you'll know what I'm talking about in a second. There's a nasty Karen rolling the camera as a seemingly able-bodied young woman pulls into that handicap spot at the grocery store. She is the villain of the story, until of course she is given the time and the platform to explain herself. Everyone is ingrained to have a preconceived notion of how somebody with a disability looks. However, according to the law offices of Cavi and Barrett, 19% of U.S. citizens are considered disabled, and this equates to roughly 62 million people. Of these 62 million, it is also estimated that 1 in 4 experience some form of discrimination at least once a day. Interacting with someone who struggles with a disability, whether physical or mental, is not uncommon, and rarely are you going to understand how or why a stranger struggles with things that may come easier to neurotypical people and able-bodied people. Even some of the most debilitating physical disabilities are not able to be seen by the naked eye. According to the University of Massachusetts, 10% of people in the U.S. struggle with what is qualified as an invisible disability, and this can include a wide range of conditions related to mental health, chronic fatigue, pain, and lung disease. And this makes up the majority of people in the U.S. who are considered disabled. Yet many people still have this idea of what makes up the outward appearance of a disabled person. An essential step that you can take to get rid of your impressions of disability is not making assumptions based on physical ability. I can specifically recall one experience I had with seemingly discrete discrimination against my dad that really struck a nerve and made me realize that there are going to be many people out there who don't consider him disabled enough. In a particularly nasty verbal altercation with our neighbor, my dad was trying to calmly explain that we needed an accessible parking spot behind our garage. My neighbor, red in the face after yelling at my dad for parking too close to the back of his truck, retorts, and he says, "Well, I've seen you take your garbage out and walk your dog around the block. You can't be that crippled." This particular instance made me all the more protective and aware of how people with disabilities face discrimination every single day. What started as an innocent butting of heads between neighbors became a personal attack on my dad and his needs. Although this comment was brash and he probably did not realize the intense punch that it packed, he made it very clear that it is important to wipe away expectations and ideas created of the disabled community. In the same way that disability can be identified on a spectrum, the same can be said for accommodation. Many disabled people have to deal with a lack of appropriate accessibility or even a lack of accommodation entirely to navigate their everyday lives. According to the United States Commission on Civil Rights and their research on the quality of life in disabled citizens, although the passing of the ADA caused a profound change in accessibility for the disabled community, there are still people out there that struggle with a lack of accessibility and accommodation. In short, although the standard of disabled people has been improved on a government level, there are still many communities that feel left out and put to the wayside. Being aware of the spectrum of disability and speaking out about a lack of accommodation for a variety of disabilities is one of the most critical steps in becoming actively anti-discriminatory. Somebody with a prosthetic body part that has mobility issues, for example, is not going to need the same level of care and accommodation as somebody who is completely unable to walk. As I had stated previously, the Lambeau Field security staff followed a given protocol for my father's case. However, they did not take the time to think about the implications of the way they treated my dad and his disability. This later proved to be harmful and quite honestly embarrassing. Being cognizant of proper accommodation and adjusting protocol to make all disabilities feel represented is one of the easiest ways to improve the standard of accessibility and public accommodation and everyday life. We must collectively work to become anti-ableist to improve the lives of disabled people around us. It has been reported that 67% of people surveyed by the disability-based charity Scope Out today find that interacting with the disabled community makes them uncomfortable. Now, whether this can be attributed to a lack of interaction with disabled people or even a lack of education around disabled rights, there's still a lingering societal stigma. In the same way that we profile physical disability, I'm sure many of us have grown up to believe that autism, for example, looks and presents in a certain way. However, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 54 children in the United States have been identified on the autism spectrum. As the name suggests, autism is a spectrum, and it presents differently in every single person diagnosed with it. The CDC also published a list of ways that we can further develop our interactions with disabled people and be actively anti-ableist. And this can include a wide range of practices, including non-discrimination, creating more inclusive products and environments, utilizing universal designs in writing, and modifying items and procedures to reasonably accommodate the disabled community. This, again, is a simple list of ways that we can do every single day to improve the lives of disabled people around us. However, many times these are tasks that prove difficult when put in a situation where you are directly interacting with disabled people. So how do we get over this stigma and truly improve the quality of accommodation for the disabled community? Do not use handicap spots unless designated by an issued placard or license plate. Even if you have to go, don't use that accessible stall and instead save it for somebody who needs it. Only purchase ADA accessible seats at events if you need them. And finally, treat the disabled community as they are, people.